The house was too clean. That was the first thing Nolan noticed when he pushed open the front door, just after 5 in the morning. Not the silence. He'd expected the silence, had even counted on it, the way a man counts on familiar things when guilt has made him careless. But the cleanliness stopped him cold. The kitchen counter bare, the dish rack empty and dry, the little ceramic bowl by the entrance where Claire always dropped her keys. Gone. He stood in the doorway, for a long moment, one hand still on the door handle, cologne he hadn't worn for his wife still clinging to his collar. "Claire?" "Nothing," he called again. Louder this time, moving through the hallway, past the framed photos on the wall. Their wedding in Banff, her parents' farm in Nova Scotia, the two of them laughing somewhere in the Laurentians, her head thrown back, completely unguarded. He barely looked at those photos anymore. He hadn't looked at much of anything that was hers in a long time. The bedroom was made. Perfectly, precisely made, the way Clare Beaumont Harris made a bed when she had somewhere important to be. Pillows aligned, corners tucked, her side of the dresser cleared. He opened the drawer, empty. He opened the closet, her half. Bare hangers and the faint smell of the lavender sachets she kept among her sweaters. Nolan sat down on the edge of the bed and stared at the wall. 16 months earlier, Clare Beaumont Harris had been the kind of woman other women quietly admired and men underestimated. She was 38, a senior financial analyst at a regional firm in Ottawa, the sort of person who remembered birthdays, kept a garden through the brutal Ontario winters with a grow light and sheer stubbornness, and showed up to every obligation she made, professional, personal, marital, with everything she had. She had married Nolan Harries 7 years ago in the Rockies in September, when the larches had just turned gold. She had loved him the way she did most things, quietly, thoroughly, with a kind of patient devotion that asked very little in return. She hadn't thought that was naive back then. She thought it was grace. The first sign she'd catalogued but not admitted was a business trip that ran a week longer than planned. Nolan worked in commercial real estate development, and trips happened. Calgary, Vancouver, occasionally Toronto. She'd learned not to plan around him. But this particular trip to Vancouver, the one in late February of that year, had produced no receipts on their shared account, a hotel she couldn't find when she searched the name, and a version of her husband, who returned smelling of a perfume she did not own. She hadn't said anything. Not yet. There was a particular kind of silence that came before knowing, a grace period maybe, or a preparation, and Claire had learned to let it sit. She had, however, started paying attention. It wasn't that she became paranoid. It was more that she became precise. She noticed which calls he took in the garage. She noticed the slight lag before he answered certain texts at dinner. She noticed that he'd started being kinder to her on the days he'd done something he felt guilty about. Bringing home flowers from the Byward Market, offering to cook, touching her shoulder in a way that felt apologetic rather than affectionate. By April, she was fairly certain. By May, she was sure. By June, she'd already spoken quietly to a lawyer. His name was Raymond Okafor, a family law specialist she'd found through a colleague at work, soft-spoken and sharp, with an office near the Rideau Center, and a reputation for being exceptionally thorough. She'd sat across from him on a Tuesday afternoon and told him calmly what she suspected, what she knew, and what she needed. "Do you have documentation?" he'd asked. "I'm building it," she'd said. He had looked at her with something that might have been respect. "Good. Keep going." Nolan's girlfriend, because that was what Vanessa Price was, regardless of the language Nolan used privately to soften it, had come into his life through a property deal the previous autumn. She was 31, worked in marketing for a boutique development firm, and had the kind of confidence that mistook itself for intelligence. Nolan had found that quality attractive. He usually did. Vanessa had no particular interest in the complications of Nolan's life. She knew he was married. She had decided, in the convenient way some people decide things, that this was his problem to sort out, not hers. She went to dinner with him. She went on weekends away. She sent him messages at 11 at night that Claire occasionally noticed lighting up his phone from across the room. What Vanessa did not know, could not know, because Nolan had not told her, and she had not thought to ask, was that Claire had spent 6 months quietly making herself invisible on paper. She'd opened a personal account at a different bank. She'd moved a portion of her salary each month, carefully, proportionally within her legal right. Into that account, she'd made copies of every financial document in the house: mortgage, investments, tax returns, his business expenses. She'd photographed the text she'd managed to see. She'd asked a trusted friend, a retired accountant, to help her understand exactly what the marital assets looked like. She hadn't done any of this out of anger. She'd done it out of clarity. There was a difference, and Clare Beaumont Harris understood it. The breaking point, the thing that moved her from preparation to action, wasn't a fight. It wasn't catching them together. It was an evening in early October when she'd come home from work to find Nolan on the phone in the kitchen, voice low, and she'd stood in the hallway long enough to hear him say, clearly and without hesitation, "She doesn't have to know anything until I'm ready. I'll deal with Clare when I decide it's time." She'd set down her bag. She'd gone upstairs. She'd sat on the edge of the bathtub and breathed through it. When she came back downstairs, dinner was on the table. He'd ordered Thai, her usual. The apologetic gesture she now read like a weather report, and she sat across from him and talked about her week and asked about his, and inside, she had already made her decision. 3 weeks later, while Nolan was at a Friday dinner with clients, she packed what she needed, called the moving company she'd prearranged, and was gone by 9 that evening. He found out the following morning, as described: the immaculate house, the empty closet, the ceramic bowl missing from the entryway. He called her phone. It rang 4 times and went to voicemail. He called again, same. He texted. 3 messages in quick succession, ranging from confused to something that tried to sound calm but wasn't. She didn't respond that day. She had moved temporarily into the apartment of her older sister, Diane, in Gatineau, just across the river. It was a small place, crowded now with Clare's boxes, and the particular tension of 2 adult women sharing close quarters. But Diane had cleared out the guest room without being asked and stocked the fridge with things Clare liked, and that small, wordless kindness had almost broken her open. "You okay?" Diane had asked, the first morning, handing her coffee. "Getting there," Clare had said, which was true in the only way that mattered. She was building toward it. Raymond Okafor filed the separation papers on Monday. Nolan's reaction moved through stages with a speed that surprised even him. First came the disbelief. She hadn't seemed angry. She hadn't said anything. How was this possible? Then came the search for logic. She must have found out about Vanessa. This was an overreaction. She'd come around. Then came something colder, which was the realization, as his own lawyer walked him through the documents Clare's lawyer had filed, that his wife had been preparing for this for quite some time. The financial picture was meticulous. Every document accounted for, every asset identified. Her contribution to the mortgage, to the investments, to the household over 7 years, laid out with the kind of precision that came from someone who did this professionally and had been doing it quietly, with her own situation in mind. "She's thorough," his lawyer said, almost impressed. Nolan was not impressed. He was, for the first time in a long time, afraid. He did what afraid men sometimes do. He overcorrected. He told Vanessa that Clare had ambushed him. He suggested to his lawyer that Clare had moved assets improperly. He made 3 attempts to contact her through mutual friends, framing himself as the wounded party, as a man whose wife had disappeared without warning or reason. But Clare had been careful about who she'd told and when. The people in her life who mattered, her sister, her closest friend Petra, her colleague who'd given her Raymond's name, had known for months. They were not available to be recruited to Nolan's version of events. Vanessa, for her part, seemed to find the whole situation inconvenient. She had assumed the marriage was essentially already over. She had not anticipated paperwork, a contested separation, or a version of Nolan who spent evenings stressed and distracted. By December, she had stopped returning his calls with the same enthusiasm. By January, she had stopped returning them at all. Clare heard about this through Petra, who had heard it from someone peripherally connected to Nolan's work circle. She felt nothing about it. That was the honest answer. She had grieved Nolan, had done most of that grieving during the months she was still living with him, still making dinner, still lying on her side of the perfectly made bed, understanding slowly, and then all at once what her marriage had become. By the time the separation papers were filed, the grief was mostly done. What she felt instead, sitting across from Raymond Okafor in his office on a gray Ottawa February afternoon, was something close to solid. like ground underfoot after a long time of not being entirely sure where she was standing. The mediation process was supposed to be straightforward. There were no children. The assets were clearly documented. Clare had not made unreasonable demands. She wanted her fair share of the matrimonial home's equity, her contribution to his business investments returned, and a clean break. Nothing punitive, nothing theatrical. Nolan's lawyer pushed back on the investment figures. Nolan, it emerged, had a different memory of who had contributed what. He had a different memory of many things, it turned out. He had a way of reshaping the past that impressed Clare in a detached way, the way you might find a natural phenomenon impressive without finding it pleasant. Raymond was unruffled. He presented the bank statements. He presented the tax documents. He presented the records Clare had kept. Consistently, patiently, over 6 months of deliberate preparation. He did this the way Clare herself operated, without drama, without performance, just the facts, laid out with such clarity that disputing them began to look increasingly like what it was. There was one afternoon in March, in a mediator's boardroom overlooking the Ottawa River, when Nolan looked across the table at Clare, and she could see the moment he understood that she had been ready for this long before he was. Something moved across his face, not quite remorse, maybe not remorse at all, but recognition. He looked at her the way you look at something you underestimated. She held his gaze for a moment and then looked back at her notes. The settlement was signed in April. The house sold in June, a seller's market, as luck would have it, and the equity was split cleanly. Clare had already begun looking at apartments in the glebe, which she'd always loved. Old trees, coffee shops, close enough to the canal that she could walk it in the mornings. She found a 2-bedroom on a quiet street, 2nd floor, with a bay window that faced east and got the morning light. She signed the lease on a Thursday and spent that first Friday evening there alone, sitting on the floor with takeout sushi and a bottle of wine she'd been saving, surrounded by her own boxes, in her own place, with the window open and the sound of the street coming in. She thought about the night she'd left, the careful, quiet efficiency of it, the moving company she'd hired arriving exactly when scheduled, her sister's voice on the phone, steady and calm, the drive across the bridge in the dark, Ottawa falling away behind her, the Ottawa River wide and black below. She had not looked back, not from any bravado or any coldness, but simply because she had already been looking forward for months, and it was time. People who knew Clare Beaumont Harris well, her sister Petra, a handful of colleagues, would say afterward that what they remembered most about that period was her composure. Not the brittle kind, the kind that shatters under pressure, the real kind. The kind built over months of quiet decisions and long evenings, and a clear-eyed understanding of what she was doing and why. She hadn't been without fear. She'd had nights in Diane's guest room when the wrongness of it all had pressed down on her. 7 years, the Banff wedding, the larches, the way she'd loved him, and she'd cried in a way she hadn't allowed herself to do in the shared house, because in the shared house she hadn't wanted him to see. But the crying had always ended, and in the morning she had gotten up. What she had decided, somewhere in those months, was that she was not going to be a woman who was happened to. She had a life she'd built. She had skills, income, a family who would have her, a lawyer who was exceptionally thorough, and a clear understanding that the version of herself who had stayed silent for too long was not the version she was willing to keep being. So she had not stayed silent. She had prepared, she had moved when she was ready, and she had walked out the door on her own terms, with her own plan, and left the perfectly made bed behind. Nolan Harries sold the commercial property venture he'd been developing, at a lower price than anticipated, under some pressure from the settlement timeline, and relocated eventually to Calgary, which was where he'd wanted to be anyway. He told people a number of things. People who knew Clare tended to listen politely. Vanessa Price moved on. She was already seeing someone else by the spring, someone without a complicated personal life, which was what she had said she wanted all along. Clare, in the east-facing apartment in the glebe, planted herbs on the windowsill in March, basil, thyme, flat-leaf parsley, and watched them grow through April and into May with the particular satisfaction of things tended properly. She did not get a dog, despite Diane's repeated suggestions. She took up running again, something she'd let go of in the grinding middle years of the marriage. The canal path in winter, the pathway along the river in the thaw. She ran early in the mornings, before the city got loud, when the light came in sideways, and the air was still cold enough to make her breath visible. Petra took her to dinner in May to celebrate the finalized settlement and made her talk about what she wanted. Going forward, not the practical things. The apartment was sorted, the finances were clean, but the other things. What she wanted her days to look like. Who she wanted to be in them. Clare had sat with the question for a while. Outside the restaurant window, Bank Street moved in its ordinary evening way. Quieter, she finally said. Not smaller. Just quieter. Petra had understood. She'd raised her glass. Clare raised hers. The evening light came through the window at an angle and landed on the table between them, warm and unremarkable, and entirely her own.